Whispers on the Plains. The sun blazed upon Jebediah's cragged features as he scanned his spread. Whirlwinds of dust skittered across the arid ground, an external echo of the disquiet churning inside him. His cattle, a patchwork of red and black hides, chewed their cud with bovine serenity, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his thoughts. Guiding a wandering calf back to its mother, the road action provided a momentary solace. He'd been a solitary figure on this ranch for longer than he cared to contemplate. Seasons blurred, each indistinguishable from the last save for the cyclical rhythms of nature and the growth of his herd. He'd forged this existence from scratch after his parents' passing, a monument to solitude built on grief. Each dawn brought the same hushed stillness. Each twilight painted a familiar, desolate panorama. A hawk wheeled in the azure heights, its piercing shriek cutting through the silence. Jebediah envied its unbound existence, its effortless command of the skies. He was earthbound, anchored to this soil, to the life he had painstakingly constructed. Yet, the foundation felt fragile lately, undermined by the constant, biting wind of isolation. Dismounting Duke, his trusty quarter horse, he secured the reins to his stunted mesquite. Jebediah retrieved a canteen from his saddlebag, the tepid water a welcome relief. He settled heavily onto a sun-scorched boulder, the quietude pressing down like a physical weight. Even a soughing of the breeze seemed to mock his loneliness. Later, back at the homestead, Jebediah slumped before a neglected plate of beans and cured pork at his time-worn table. He unfolded the sporadically delivered newspaper, its headlines usually a perfunctory glance at a world that felt increasingly remote. But today a discreet advertisement tucked within the classifieds snagged his attention. Seeking partner. Cheerful, diligent young woman seeks marriage and a new beginning. Reply to Box 34, Harmony Creek Gazette. Jebediah fixated on the words, a nervous flutter in his chest. He hadn't genuinely considered companionship in years. The notion was both daunting and invigorating. He was a plain-spoken man, a rancher, hardly a desirable match. And what did he truly know of women? His contact was limited to hurried trips to town and a brief acknowledgement to Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile. He reread the advertisement, his brow furrowed in thought. A new beginning that resonated deeply. He'd had his own, inheriting this ranch when barely out of boyhood. But the woman, what manner of person would respond to such an appeal? Was she desperate, deceptive, or simply hopeful? He pushed away from the table, the chair screeching against the floorboards. He paced the compact room, the newspaper clutched in his fist. Shadows lengthened, draping the interior in somber tones of gray and uncertainty. His gaze drifted to the framed portrait on the mantelpiece, his parents, young and radiant, embracing. He recalled their mirth, their easy tenderness. He yearned for that connection, that sense of belonging. He halted his pacing, approaching the window to gaze at the sprawling expanse of his land. The wind had quickened, stirring the brittle grasses. The whispers carried on the breeze seemed to urge him onward, to embrace risk, to pursue something more fulfilling. He conjured the long, empty nights, the silent meals, the unending solitude. He imagined the warmth of a hand in his, the sound of laughter echoing in the house, the solace of shared life. Jebediah pivoted from the window, his resolve firming. Returning to the table, he grasped a pen, dipping it into the inkwell. He paused, his hand betraying a slight tremor. Then, with a steadying breath, he commenced writing. The words were simple, direct, truthful. They were the words of a man adrift, reaching out into the void, yearning for a glimmer of light. He addressed the envelope, his hand now sure. Box 34, Harmony Creek Gazette. He'd ride into town on the morrow. He'd post the letter. He'd discover what destiny held for him. The decision settled. An unfamiliar tranquility washed over him. He consumed his beans and salt pork, the meal more palatable than it had been in weeks. He stoked the embers in the hearth, secured the door latch, and sought his bed. As he lay in the darkness, the whispers on the plains seemed transformed, no longer derisive, but infused with a tentative optimism. He closed his eyes, a subtle smile gracing his lips. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jebediah Stone dreamt of a future less barren. A leap of faith. The buckboard wheels ate up the miles, each rotation a turning of the page on Jebediah's solitary life. Dust devils danced on the horizon, mimicking the swirling uncertainty in his gut. 3 days he'd been on the road, the landscape flattening from rolling hills to sun-baked plains, the air growing thick and heavy with the promise of rain that never came. The rhythmic creak of the wagon and the steady plod of the horses were his only company, his thoughts a jumbled landscape of hope and apprehension. He worried the brim of his hat, the leather ruff against his calloused fingers. He found the town, Harmony Creek, a scattering of buildings clinging to the earth like desperate vines. It wasn't much, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that looked permanently on the verge of collapse, and a handful of houses huddled together for warmth. The address Alara's mother, Ruth, had provided led him to a small, ramshackle house on the edge of town, paint peeling like sunburnt skin. He hitched the horses and stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath his weight. He raised a hand and knocked, the sound echoing in the still afternoon air. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with sharp features and eyes that assessed him with unsettling precision. Ruth, Jebediah Stone. Her voice was as dry as the parched earth. "Ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat. She opened the door wider, gesturing him inside. The house was dim and smelled of stale, cooking, and something vaguely medicinal. Ruth led him into a small, cluttered parlor. "Alara is indisposed at the moment," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We should discuss the arrangements." Jebediah settled onto a threadbare sofa, the springs protesting beneath him. "Arrangements? The agreement," Ruth corrected, a hint of impatience in her voice. "As outlined in my letter. The sum we discussed. Payable now." Jebediah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He handed it to her. Ruth snatched it, her fingers surprisingly nimble, and quickly counted the bills inside. "Satisfactory," she said, tucking the money away in the folds of her dress. "Now about Alara." Before she could continue, a door at the back of the house opened, and Alara stepped into the room. She was smaller than Jebediah had imagined, her frame thin and fragile. Her eyes, however, were large and dark, filled with a sadness that tugged at his heart. She was pale, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, emphasizing the delicate angles of her face. "Mother." Her voice was barely a whisper. Ruth turned, her expression softening slightly, though Jebediah suspected it was a performance. "Alara, Mr. Stone is here." Alara's gaze flickered to Jebediah, then quickly darted away. She seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. He stood, feeling awkward and immense in the small room. "Miss Alara," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "It's a long ride back to the ranch. Are you ready?" Alara looked at her mother, a silent plea in her eyes. Ruth met her gaze with a cold indifference. "Alara understands the opportunity before her," Ruth said, her voice laced with a false sweetness that grated on Jebediah's nerves. "Don't you, dear?" Alara swallowed hard, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "Yes, mother." Jebediah saw the fear in her eyes, the unspoken desperation. He knew then that he couldn't leave her here. He wouldn't. He reached out a hand, hesitant but firm. "Miss Alara," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "If you're ready, let's go home." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope igniting within their depths. She looked at her mother one last time, then slowly, cautiously, placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold and trembling. "Goodbye, Mother," she said, her voice barely audible. Ruth offered a curt nod, her attention already turning back to the parlor. Jebediah squeezed Alara's hand gently and led her out of the house, the door clicking shut behind them, severing her ties to this place. As they walked towards the buckboard, a sudden gust of wind swept through the town, carrying with it the scent of rain. Jebediah helped Alara into the wagon, the movement stiff and careful. He climbed in beside her, took up the reins, and with a gentle cluck to the horses, turned the wagon towards the horizon, towards the unknown future that awaited them both. New beginnings, heavy burdens. Gravel crunched under the wagon wheels, each rotation ratcheting up Alara's apprehension as they approached Jebediah's ranch house. The panorama spread before her was a far cry from her prior confinement. Overhead, an immense cerulean dome stretched seemingly forever, dotted with colossal cottonwoods that murmured secrets to the breeze. The air, saturated with the fragrances of sun-baked earth and sage, expanded within her lungs, unlike the stale, smoke-laden air she knew. A robust, two-story dwelling constructed from roughly hewn timbers greeted her. A generous veranda circled the facade, canopied by a riot of climbing wisteria. It conveyed a sense of resolute strength, mirroring the man she'd just met. Jebediah, surprisingly agile for a man of his heft, dismounted. He offered Alara a hand, his palm rough with calluses, yet conveying an unexpected gentleness. She hesitated, then accepted his assistance, their fingers briefly meeting. The brief touch ignited a spark, a mingling of apprehension and nascent anticipation. "Welcome!" Jebediah's voice resonated, a deep baritone. "It's not much to look at, but it's home." Alara swallowed, her gaze drinking in the vista. Horses grazed placidly in the far pasture, their coats shimmering in the afternoon light. Near a time-worn barn, chickens pecked busily, while a scruffy, lop-eared dog ambled over, tail wagging tentatively in greeting. It was an oasis of calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil she had left behind. Jebediah ushered her indoors. Within, the house was cloaked in shadow, the stout log walls filtering the sunlight. The aroma of wood smoke and cured leather hung in the air, a comforting, masculine essence. A grand stone hearth dominated one wall. A threadbare rug softened the timber floor. "Let me show you to your room," Jebediah offered, his tone laced with kindness. He lifted the battered suitcase Ruth had unceremoniously dumped into the wagon and motioned for Alara to follow him up a narrow flight of stairs. The room was modest but neat, with walls painted a pale white and a solitary window overlooking the pasture. A simple wooden bed was adorned with a colorful patchwork quilt, and a small chest of drawers stood against one wall. It was austere, but it was hers. "Hope it suits you," Jebediah said, setting down her luggage. "Let me know if you need anything at all." Alara stood rooted to the spot, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the distant trilling of crickets. She felt like a bird freed from confinement, only to find itself adrift in an immense, bewildering expanse. "Thank you," she breathed, barely audible. Jebediah nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before turning to depart, closing the door quietly behind him. Alara sank onto the bed, the quilt cool against her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, attempting to banish the memories that threatened to drown her. Ruth's cruel pronouncements, the smoky atmosphere of the tavern, the predatory stares of men, all were seared into her mind, a persistent reminder of her former life. Opening her eyes, she gazed up at the ceiling, her heart hammering in her chest. Could she place her trust in Jebediah? His demeanor had been kind, even generous, but she had long since learned that such kindness could be a facade, concealing less honorable intentions. She rose and moved to the window, her gaze drawn to the tranquil scene outside. The horses continued their grazing, their movements unhurried and deliberate. The sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, bathing the sky in vibrant hues of amber and violet. It was breathtaking, serene, everything she had ever yearned for. Yet, the beauty was marred by trepidation, apprehension of the unknown, fear of treachery, the dread that she had merely exchanged one cage for another. She carried within her not only a child, but also a weighty burden of distrust, a weight threatening to overwhelm her. Lowering her hand, she touched her abdomen, a silent vow to the child growing within. She would safeguard it, no matter the cost. She would find a way to make this new existence work, even if it entailed battling her own internal demons at every turn. She had to. For her child's sake, she had to. As dusk settled, Alara remained by the window, her eyes fixed on the distant skyline. The ranch lay still, at peace, yet a tempest raged within her. The seeds of hope had been sown, but they struggled to flourish in the arid soil of her past. The storm. The wind started as a whisper, a rustling through the tall grasses that bordered the ranch. Alara, hanging laundry on the line, paused, a prickle of unease on her skin. The sky, moments before a brilliant, cloudless blue, was now bruised with purple and gray. A distant rumble echoed across the plains. Jebediah emerged from the barn, his weathered face turned towards the horizon. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Storm's comin'," he said, his voice flat. "And she's a mean one." Alara felt a surge of panic. She'd seen storms before, but never one that looked quite so angry. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a restless energy. She clutched the laundry basket tighter. "What do we do?" Jebediah was already moving, his gait surprisingly quick for a man of his age. "We get the stock secured. Fastest way to lose half your herd is to have them run off in a storm like this." He didn't wait for her to answer, heading towards the corral where the cattle were beginning to mill restlessly, their low moans rising above the wind. Alara hesitated, then followed, driven by a mixture of fear and a burgeoning sense of responsibility. This was her home now, however temporary. The wind intensified, whipping her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. Dust devils danced across the parched earth. The cattle, sensing the impending danger, grew more agitated, their hooves churning the ground. Jebediah, using a combination of firm words and practiced movements, began to herd them towards the sturdier section of the barn. "Help me with the gate," he yelled above the rising roar of the wind. Alara scrambled to obey, her hands fumbling with the heavy latch. The gate swung shut with a clang, the cattle safely inside. But the horses, further out in the pasture, were another matter. "Horses!" Jebediah shouted, pointing towards the distant figures galloping erratically. "They'll bolt if we don't get them in the stable." He mounted his own horse, a sturdy paint mare, and spurred her into a gallop, disappearing into the swirling dust. Alara watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm was closing in fast, the sky now a swirling vortex of gray. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the parched earth. She knew she couldn't just stand there. Jebediah was out there alone. She ran towards the barn, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, she found a stack of thick blankets. Grabbing one, she hesitated, then pulled on Jebediah's oilskin coat, which hung on a peg near the door. It was far too big for her, but the weight of it was comforting. She ran back outside, the rain now coming down in sheets. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes, making it almost impossible to see. She stumbled towards the pasture, squinting through the downpour. She saw Jebediah then, wrestling with a particularly skittish mare, trying to guide her towards the stable. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in a blinding white light, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The mare reared, nearly unseating Jebediah. Fear lent Alara strength. She ran towards them, waving the blanket, trying to distract the mare. It worked. The horse, startled by the sudden movement, calmed slightly, allowing Jebediah to regain control. Together, they managed to herd the horses into the stable, securing the heavy wooden doors just as the storm unleashed its full fury. They stood for a moment, panting, soaked to the bone. The rain hammered against the barn roof, the wind rattling the walls. Alara looked at Jebediah, his face grim, his eyes narrowed against the wind. He was a force of nature himself, weathered and unyielding. He looked back at her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher in his gaze. Respect? Gratitude? Maybe even surprise? "You did good, Alara May," he said, his voice hoarse. "Real good." He didn't say anything else, but the words, simple as they were, warmed her from the inside out. They huddled together in the relative shelter of the barn, listening to the storm rage outside. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Elara felt a sense of belonging, a shared purpose. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by a newfound respect for the man beside her and a burgeoning belief in her own strength. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, a fragile connection had been forged, a spark of something new ignited in the heart of the storm. Preparing for a miracle, the tempest had departed, leaving a world cleansed and glistening, yet the ensuing quiet hummed with a different tenor. No longer the solitary stillness Jebediah knew so well. This was a hushed expectation, a world holding its breath for a dawn unknown. The feeling pulsed strongest in the upstairs room, once merely a repository for surplus tack and discarded tools, now an expectant void. His foray into preparedness began with a tome. A hefty, intimidating book entitled A Practical Guide to Childbirth and Infant Care. Procured from town, it cost him the sideways glances and barely veiled amusement of the townsfolk. Hours melted as he pored over its pages, brow furrowed in fierce concentration. The clinical language felt alien, the illustrations baffling. He grappled with stages of labor, potential hazards, the episiotomy. The book snapped shut then, a hot flush rising up his neck. Some mysteries were best left unprobed by a man. Elara often discovered him dozing in his armchair, the weighty book askew on his chest, a half-eaten apple a precarious monument upon its cover. She'd retrieve the fruit with a silent grace and drape a blanket over his broad shoulders. Occasionally, the mumble of Braxton Hicks would escape his lips in slumber, prompting a private smile to grace her face. Slowly, painstakingly, the nursery materialized. Jebediah, far more at ease wrestling with barbed wire than assembling a cradle, met the task with methodical resolve. He coaxed the old wooden crib until its surfaces felt like polished ivory, the rasp of sandpaper orchestrating a comforting rhythm throughout the house. He bathed it in soft, cream-colored paint, pausing to admire his handiwork between brushstrokes. He even dared to sew a quilt, a vibrant collage of old shirts and repurposed denim. The result, homespun, yet undeniably forged in love. Elara watched him, her initial unease steadily receding. She began to offer gentle suggestions, pointing out a whistling window, needing weather stripping, or a jagged protuberance on the hand-carved rocking horse. He absorbed her words, his rough edges softening with each sunrise. One afternoon, Doc Miller arrived in his time-worn buggy, his countenance a mask of concern. "Jebediah," he began, his tone serious. "We need to talk about Elara's condition." They settled on the porch, the swing a steady metronome accompanying the doctor's somber words. "She's slight of frame, Jebediah, and she was depleted when she arrived. This pregnancy could be fraught. The odds of complications increase." Jebediah's jaw hardened, his knuckles white. "What sort of complications?" Doc Miller exhaled deeply. "Early labor, difficult birth, issues following delivery. We need to brace ourselves for any eventuality." He lingered, then added, "And Jebediah, she requires rest. A cessation of heavy burdens, a halt to arduous activities." Jebediah nodded, gaze lost on the horizon. "She will have it." Doc Miller scrutinized him, a spark of hope flickering within his gaze. "Do you grasp the gravity, Jebediah? This isn't solely about ushering a child into existence. It's about safeguarding Elara's well-being, too." "I grasp it," Jebediah affirmed, his voice a low rumble of resolve. After Doc Miller's departure, Jebediah sought Elara. He found her in the garden, tending what blossoms had bravely endured the recent storm. He knelt beside her, his large hand engulfing hers. "Elara," he murmured, his voice laced with tenderness, "Doc Miller insists you lighten your load." She met his gaze, her eyes swirling with both appreciation and defiance. "I am not infirm, Jebediah. I know you're not," he countered gently, "but this is not about weakness. It's about cherishing yourself and the child within." A pause, then, "Allow me to care for you both." Elara contemplated him, her expression an unreadable tableau. Silence stretched, thick and pregnant with unspoken words. At last, she reached out, her fingers tracing the lines of his rough hand. "Thank you, Jebediah," she breathed. He offered no reply, merely returning the gentle pressure of her hand. Words felt flimsy, inadequate. He would demonstrate it, each day, in every way imaginable, the depth of his promise. He would ready himself for this miracle, not just with books and fresh coats of paint, but with his very core, his spirit, and every fiber of his being. He would be poised, born in the blizzard. The wind was a ravening beast, hammering against the homestead. Jebediah fed the hearth another chunk of wood, its flames a defiant orange against the encroaching gloom. Snow plastered the window panes, turning the world outside into an indistinct blur of white. The blizzard had been raging for an eternity, an obliterating curtain drawn across the landscape. He yearned for its end. Alara's breath hitched in slumber. He observed her. The shallow cadence of her respiration troubled him. Doc Miller's grim prognosis replayed in his thoughts. Delicate constitution, a taxing delivery. He banished the dread, clinging to the present moment, to the promise he'd made to safeguard her. A sudden, sharp intake of breath shattered the silence. Jebediah was instantly kneeling beside her. "Alara? What's wrong?" Her features twisted in agony, hands cradling her swollen abdomen. "Jebediah, it's coming." A cold fist clenched around his heart. Too soon by weeks. He grasped her hand, his rough skin seeking purchase in hers. "Easy now, sweetheart. I'm right here." He had to reach Doc Miller. He lunged for the radio, offering up a silent prayer for its functionality. Static hissed, followed by a weak, distant signal. He bellowed into the microphone, his voice cracking against the wind's ferocity. "Doc! Doc Miller, are you there? Alara's in labor. Premature." The reply was fragmented, almost lost in the ether. "The storm. Can't get through. Road's impassable. I'll instruct you." Jebediah felt the ground drop out from under him. He was alone in this. He strained to hear, furiously jotting down fragmented instructions as Doc Miller's voice flickered in and out. Hanging up, his hands trembled violently. He turned to Alara, her face ashen, perspiration glistening on her brow. He must be resolute. He had to see this through. He gathered every piece of linen he could find, blankets, cloths, anything that might serve. Water went on to boil, his movements frantic yet purposeful. He summoned the memory of dog-eared books, anatomical diagrams studied by lamplight. He clawed at his recollection, desperate to assemble the necessary knowledge. Hours melted into a single, agonizing stretch. The tempest roared outside, a reflection of the turmoil within the room's confines. Alara's cries tore through the air, ragged and primal. Kneeling by her side, Jebediah daubed at her forehead, offering hollow reassurances, unsure if she even registered his presence. He followed Doc Miller's distant guidance, his hands clumsy yet unflinching. He caught sight of the head, a fragile halo of dark hair. "Nearly there, Alara," he croaked, his voice thick with emotion. "You're doing wonderfully." One last surge, a final, piercing scream, and then a newborn squall. A miniature, vulnerable being lay cradled in his palms, slick and gasping. Gently, he cleansed her, his hands shaking with a potent cocktail of terror and reverence. Swaddling her in a warm blanket, he placed her in Alara's embrace. "A girl," he breathed, his voice choked with emotion. "A beautiful, perfect little girl." Alara gazed at the infant, tears brimming in her eyes. "Sarah Beth," she whispered, her voice faint but imbued with love. Jebediah watched them, the two bonded souls illuminated by the gentle lamplight's halo. Though the storm continued its assault, inside the cabin a fragile peace reigned, a silent miracle wrought amidst the blizzard's fury. A feeling he hadn't known for years bloomed within him, a fragile seed of hope. A miracle found. When Jebediah first cradled Sarah Beth, a tremor went through him, unlike any grief he knew. Not wails and chest-heaving sobs, but a silent quake originating deep within. She felt impossibly small, a perfect, scaled-down person resting in his rough palms. Her miniature fingers, barely the length of his thumb's top joint, latched onto his finger with surprising tenacity. Hours dissolved as he sat rocking, the fireplace murmuring its low song, utterly absorbed in the rise and fall of her chest. Nearby, Elara slept, exhaustion painting her face with serenity. A feeling utterly new to him bloomed, a raw, instinctive urge to protect, laced with a tenderness he'd never imagined possessing. Jebediah Stone, the unflinching rancher, was humbled, utterly undone by this tiny girl. As Alara's eyes fluttered awake, a faint smile touched her lips. "Isn't she lovely?" she murmured, her voice husky with fatigue. Swallowing against a sudden thickness in his throat, Jebediah could only nod, his gaze riveted. Alara shifted, a wince betraying her discomfort. "May I hold her?" He carefully rose, carrying Sarabeth to her bedside, supporting her as Alara tentatively stroked the baby's soft cheek. Watching Alara, he saw love and weariness intermingled, a nascent joy kindling within her gaze. A rhythm soon dictated life on the ranch. Jebediah wrestled with diapers, his oversized hands discovering surprising gentleness. He learned the precise hold that soothed Sarabeth's cries, the low hum that quieted her. Though Alara, regaining her strength, shouldered most of the care, Jebediah remained ever present, a silent sentinel. He'd lose himself watching them, a profound, unfamiliar happiness filling his heart. The storm that ushered Sarabeth into the world had, in a way, cleansed the air. The grip of winter finally loosened, yielding to a hesitant spring. And something subtly shifted in Meadow Creek. At first, only veiled looks and murmurs circulated. Then, Mrs. Henderson, Meadow Creek's de facto leader, appeared with a basket overflowing with warm bread. She stood awkwardly, hands clasped tightly before her. "Heard about the little blessing," she offered, her tone gruff but well-meaning. "Thought you might appreciate a bit of baking." Surprised, Jebediah simply nodded, accepting the gift. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Henderson paused, then, "I'd be obliged for a peek at the babe, if you wouldn't mind." He stepped aside. Alara, cradling Sarabeth, offered a shy smile. A wave of tenderness softened Mrs. Henderson's features. "She's a dear," she said, her voice gentler, a true image of her father. The following days brought similar visits. Neighbors brought casseroles, homespun blankets, offers of assistance. They witnessed the unguarded adoration in Jebediah's eyes as he looked upon Sarabeth. They saw Alara's quiet resilience and the undeniable love she had for her daughter. They saw a family, unconventional perhaps, but indisputably a family. One sun-drenched afternoon, Jebediah sat on the porch, carving a small wooden horse, while Sarabeth slept peacefully in her cradle. Alara joined him, leaning against the railing. "There, accepting us," she breathed, her voice a mixture of relief and astonishment. Jebediah met her gaze, a rare smile illuminating his face. "They're decent folk, Alara." He glanced at the unfinished toy in his hands. It was rough-hewn, far from perfect, but imbued with love. He reflected on the life he had carved out for himself, the solitude that had been his constant companion, and he considered the miracle that had arrived with the storm. He studied Alara, the way the sunlight kissed her hair, the delicate curve of her cheek. He saw gratitude shimmering in her eyes, nascent trust gradually eclipsing the old fear. They had a long road ahead, he knew. The wounds of the past wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jebediah Stone felt hope, a sense of belonging. He had discovered family, not as he'd envisioned, but in a far more profound way. And within that family, he had found a miracle, Ruth's return. The spring sun painted the Meadow Creek Valley in strokes of vibrant green and gold, a stark contrast to the stark white landscape that had heralded Sarabeth's arrival. Alara hummed softly as she hung laundry on the line, the scent of sunshine and soap filling the air. Sarabeth, nestled in a makeshift cradle woven from willow branches, gurgled contentedly, her tiny hands batting at the dandelions Alara had placed nearby. Life on the ranch, once a silent, echoing expanse, now throbbed with a quiet joy. Jebediah, usually occupied with mending fences or tending the livestock, often found himself lingering near Alara and the baby, his weathered face softened by an almost shy smile. He'd even started bringing Alara wildflowers he found on his rounds, presenting them with a gruff, "Thought you might like these." Alara found solace in the rhythm of her days. She learned to milk the cows, her hands growing stronger and more confident. She planted a small vegetable garden, envisioning summer salads and jars of preserved tomatoes for the winter. She even started sketching again, filling notebooks with drawings of Sarabeth, the surrounding landscape, and the simple beauty she found in her new life. For the first time, Alara felt a sense of belonging, a sense of home. The tranquility shattered with the crunch of gravel under unfamiliar wheels. A sleek, black automobile, a jarring contrast to Jebediah's dusty truck, pulled up to the ranch house. Alara's breath hitched in her throat. A figure emerged, tall and imposing, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed utterly out of place amidst the rustic surroundings. Ruth. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't seen her mother since the transaction. A wave of nausea washed over her. She instinctively moved closer to Sarabeth's cradle, a protective instinct flaring within her. Ruth surveyed the scene with a disdainful curl of her lip. Well, Alara May, living the pioneer woman fantasy, are we? Her voice dripped with sarcasm, a familiar weapon Alara had endured for years. Jebediah emerged from the barn, his eyes narrowed, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He placed himself between Alara and Ruth, his presence a solid wall of quiet strength. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Ruth ignored him, her gaze fixed on Alara. "I've come for my daughter and my granddaughter. It's time to come home, Alara. This charade has gone on long enough." Alara's voice trembled. "This is my home, Mama." Ruth's smile was sharp and cold. "Don't be ridiculous. A hovel in the middle of nowhere, and married to this." She gestured dismissively at Jebediah. "You deserve better, Alara. You always have." "I have everything I need right here," Alara insisted, her voice gaining strength. She reached down and gently stroked Sarabeth's cheek. "I'm not leaving." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Don't be hasty, Alara. Think of the baby. You can't raise her in this poverty. I can offer her a good life, opportunities you can't even imagine." Jebediah stepped forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "Alara and Sarabeth are staying here. You need to leave." Ruth's gaze flicked to Jebediah, a calculating glint in her eyes. "Are you sure about that, Mr. Stone? I wouldn't want certain details about your arrangement to become public knowledge. The town might not look so kindly on a man who purchased a young, pregnant woman, especially after I explained how lonely you were." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Gossip travels fast in a small town, doesn't it?" Alara gasped, her face paling. She hadn't considered the potential repercussions, the way Ruth could twist the truth and poison the community against them. The fragile acceptance they had begun to experience threatened to shatter. Jebediah's jaw tightened. He knew Ruth was capable of anything. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. He wouldn't let Ruth hurt her, or Sarabeth, but he also knew the damage her words could inflict. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken threats and a looming sense of dread. The spring sunshine seemed to dim, casting long, ominous shadows across the ranch. A family forged in love. Ruth Harding, a splash of chintz against the weathered wood, anchored herself in the doorway. "Alara May, this charade ends now. Pack. We're going back." Alara, Sarabeth nestled in her arms, remained unmoved. Hearthlight danced across her features, illuminating the grit in her gaze. "This is where I belong, Mama." The painted smile wavered on Ruth's face. "Don't be ridiculous. He's a taciturn hermit. You belong where you can find a suitable match." Jebediah, still as a carving by the window, set down his knife, The fatherly warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a flinty resolve. Though silent, his disapproval choked the air. Jebediah possesses more integrity than any man I've ever met, Elara countered, her voice firm. And he's Sarabeth's father. Ruth dismissed this with a scoff and a flip of her wrist. Easily ignored. We won't speak of the circumstances that brought you here, Elara. The disgrace? Elara's tone sharpened, though she struggled to control it. The disgrace lies in bartering your daughter away. I'm not ashamed of my life here. I embrace it. Sarabeth stirred, her clear blue eyes widening inquisitively. Elara pressed a kiss to her daughter's brow, a silent vow of protection. Ruth's composure fractured. You ungrateful girl. I acted in your best interest. No, you acted in your own. The words left Elara softly, yet resonated with a newfound strength. You crave the security. You always have. Jebediah unfolded his large frame and moved toward Ruth, boots whispering on the floorboards. He halted a few feet away, his towering presence a silent storm. Without touch or raised voice, he exuded raw power. You will leave now. For the first time, fear flickered in Ruth's eyes. She stammered. You can't dictate to me. She's my daughter. She's my wife, Jebediah stated, his voice a low rumble. And Sarabeth is my daughter. This is their home. You are not welcome. Ruth shot a venomous glare at Elara, her eyes slits of resentment. You'll come to regret this, Elara May. You'll crawl back, begging. Elara met her mother's gaze, unwavering. No, Mama, I won't. Ruth spun on her heel and slammed the door, the sound of sharp punctuation to the tense exchange. Elara's shoulders sagged with release. She turned to Jebediah, his face still creased with worry. Thank you, she breathed. He simply nodded and grazed Sarabeth's cheek with a rough finger. The baby cooed and grasped at his hand. Elara inhaled deeply, then locked eyes with Jebediah. I love you, Jebediah. The declaration felt foreign yet true, igniting a warmth that banished the lingering shadows. I love you both. Surprise flickered across Jebediah's face, replaced by a tenderness she hadn't seen before. He didn't echo the words, but his gaze, usually so guarded, was an open book. He reached out and gently cradled Elara's face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. A small gesture that meant everything. Time flowed, marked by seasons and laughter. Sarabeth blossomed into a vibrant child, inheriting Jebediah's quiet strength and Elara's empathy. She reveled in the ranch, chasing butterflies through the meadow and bombarding Jebediah with cosmic questions. Ruth never reappeared. Elara sometimes felt a twinge of sadness mingled with relief. She had embraced her own destiny, one built on love and fortitude. Years later, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Jebediah, Elara, and Sarabeth swayed gently on the porch swing. Sarabeth, now 7, nestled between her parents, her small hand secure in Jebediah's. Papa, she piped, is the sky burning? Jebediah chuckled, a rare and cherished sound. No, little one. It's just the sun saying goodnight. Elara rested her head against Jebediah's shoulder, a wave of contentment washing over her. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of wildflowers and rich earth. She gazed at Jebediah, his face a tapestry of sun and wind, his eyes overflowing with love. She looked at Sarabeth, her face alight with joy. This was her family. This was home, and it was all she could ever want.